It's a real pleasure to be here, and I think this is a very important conference. You know, as policy advisor to the Born Free Foundation, I get involved in a lot of issues around ethical tourism, looking at exploitation of animals, and that's issues very close to my heart. But as Badger Trust Chief Executive as well, I wanted really to talk to you today about what we can do here in our own communities for wildlife protection, and particularly to look at the badger. The badger has become, I think, a real sort of issue of debate, a lightning rod issue about the future of our countryside, about the future of our farming industry, and also about wildlife and how we have to protect it and how important that is. It's worth remembering that despite all of the great work that's done around the world by Born Free and other charities to protect animals, there's an awful lot that we need to do here at home as well. In my lifetime, since I was born in 1970, there's been a reduction in the number of species, wild species in this country in terms of numbers by around 50%. And what we're finding is that many of the animals that we grew up with are under real pressure today from human development, from wildlife crime, from problems relating to disease control management and other issues. And we really do need to address these. And what we're really trying to do in terms of the work with the Badger Trust, with volunteers giving us a huge amount of support, is becoming that sort of barrier, that protection for the future of a species that's lived in our isles for many hundreds of thousands of years. So what I really want to do is tell you a little bit about the badger, about many of the issues relating to how it survives in our isles, but also the many threats that it faces and how people are reacting to that and how important volunteering is to make that happen. Just a bit about badger ecology, really, just to give you an idea about what we're talking about here. The badger is a mammal, a member of what's called the mustelid group of mammals. That's weasels, wolverines, minks, ferrets, and polecats. It's native to most of Europe and the Middle East. It's classified under the IUCN as being an animal of least concern in terms of conservation. So it's got a relatively healthy populations of badgers across Europe, but many of them are under key threats, and we'll talk about that obviously more in relation to the United Kingdom. At the moment in the UK, we believe we probably have around 300,000 badgers, but that varies depending on disease within badger communities. We probably lose 50,000 badgers a year on the roads alone. We face real problems with illegal persecution of badgers, and so far over the last 3 years, 15,000 of them have been killed because of a government licensed culling program, and that's likely to be extended massively in the years ahead as well. What does a badger eat? Well, it's a carnivore primarily, but it's omnivorous as well because it does eat plant-based foods. It primarily lives on earthworms, but it will eat insects and other small mammals, but it'll also eat peanuts, apples, and fruits. It's a real survivor of an animal, an amazingly industrious, powerful animal that can survive most of what humans throw against it, and in the most difficult conditions as well. They live in social groups around 5 to 10 animals. The males are called boars, the females are called sows. They live in sets, very complex underground tunnel systems. Now, some of these sets you'll find around Britain can be 400 or 500 years old. They're that complex and well built, with tunnels and entrances going up at different angles and areas, and many of them can be very large. Badgers can live between 2 or 3 separate sets at any one point in time. Badgers are primarily living within our countryside, but also increasingly within our towns and cities as well. There are many badgers to be found around, for example, the suburbs of Birmingham. Quite a healthy badger population, very close to where we are here today, believe it or not. These animals are very difficult to see in the wild because they're nocturnal. Most of us only see a badger when it's dead by the side of the road, but there are signs. We can see their paw prints. We can see badger hairs, which are very coarse and often will be found on barbed wire and fences, scratch marks on trees. They're very clean animals. They actually have their own little latrines where they will go and do their business. They won't do it in their set. So if you want to go badger spotting, which many people do, they get very excited by looking at badger poo. Don't ask me why, but it's one of those things that gets badger watchers very excited indeed. And often you will see trails as well. Badgers have trails and paths that they will follow. So if you go through fields, you will actually see where the badgers move. Those trails are actually quite clear when you know what you're looking for. They are found in most of the UK, and also, as I said earlier on, in suburbs, which causes some problems because these badgers can be very good diggers and they can cause particular difficulties in garden environments as well. The badger set is very distinct from a rabbit hole. They are much larger, they're much more complex tunnel systems. When you know what you're looking for, you'll see very clearly what is a badger set and what is not. You can see some examples here. Badgers have lived within our isles really probably for around 500,000 years. They returned after the Ice Age in large numbers to the United Kingdom. We've had a love-hate relationship with this animal, to be honest with you. If you go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, the animal had no royal protection as such, like deer or game birds. So basically, it was left to the poor in the rural communities to do what they wanted with the badger. So they used to dig it out, and they would use it in inns to fight with dogs. They're very, very powerful animals, very muscular, low squat, very powerful jaws and claws. If you want to fight a badger against a dog, it will be the ultimate test of strength between the two animals. Horrible, horrible issue, which we still have to deal with today. But if you went back to the 17th and 18th centuries, you would find badgers in inns up and down the country that were fought to the death, and money would be gambled on that particular aspect of the fighting that we would find going on at the time. Lots more interest in badger conservation towards the 19th and early 20th century, but we found an awful lot of badger baiting. This idea that people would take dogs and put them down badger sets became much worse during that period of time because of the Industrial Revolution. So what we found is that lots of miners would basically spend their weekends when they weren't digging coal out of deep mine shafts by taking their dogs and putting them down badger sets. This became a massive issue of concern for conservationists. By the 1920s and 30s, we were seeing thousands of badger sets destroyed, many thousands of animals were being killed, and this is what brought about the first volunteer networks to protect this species. By the 1950s and 60s, the first badger protection groups were being set up in places like Gwent and the Wirral and Cheshire areas. And what we found is that people were going and sitting on badger sets, effectively trying to stop the badger baiters coming on at night. And what they did is they forced into Parliament a private members bill in the early 1970s to give protection to the species. And this brought about the first act of law to protect badgers in 1973, the Protection of Badgers Act, which has since been updated with the Countryside Wildlife Act and other pieces of legislation. So it is now illegal for anyone to destroy or tamper with a badger set or to kill a badger. And there's fines of around £5,000 or 6 months in prison as a consequence of those illegal actions. But that does not mean that the badger is protected. I say it's probably the most persecuted species with protection in the UK today. Badger baiting is still a problem. Across northern England in particular, we have thousands of badgers that are killed every year by baiters. We have property developers destroying badger sets because as we actually try and expand housing into new areas of the green belt, and that's a pressure that's growing all the time, many developers are willing to risk breaking the law by putting a bulldozer over a badger set just to get that home built and to make the money as a consequence. We also find that hunts, fox hunts that still go on, often fill in badger sets because the hounds will actually get taken away from the scent and will go down a badger set as a consequence. So you will find huntsmen out there illegally covering badger sets as well. And then you just find that lots of farmers and landowners, I'm afraid, are so much of the view that the badger is to blame, and we'll talk in a moment about bovine TB, that they take the law into their own hands. We have badgers gassed, we have badgers shot, we have badgers snared, we even have badgers skinned alive and left by the side of the road. If you see some of the horrible images that we get from the Badger Trust regularly of persecution, you will know the struggle this animal faces to survive. Bovine TB is probably one of the biggest threats to the future of the badger in this country today. Now, bovine TB is a massive social economic problem for farmers in Britain, particularly dairy livestock farmers. It will result in your herd being shut down. You can't sell your cattle. It will result in animals being destroyed. You'll be compensated, but not for the lifetime of the animal, only for the value of it at the point of destruction. I have a lot of sympathy for farmers. I've worked in agriculture and farming for much of my career, but I'm afraid the badger has been demonized as part of the debate about its role in bovine TB spread. We know that 95%, and this is scientists within DEFRA that will tell us this, of bovine TB spread is from cattle to cattle. We know that badgers and other wildlife have got bovine TB as a result of a spillover of the disease from cattle into wildlife. What we don't know is that badgers can easily pass TB back to cattle. We had one experiment in 1975 where we effectively locked badgers that were injected to the point where they were bursting with TB into pens, and then we put cattle into those pens alongside them. It took 6 months for the first calf to actually become infected, even though it was living cheek by jowl with a badger defecating and urinating on top of it. The scientists involved in that experiment accepted it wasn't fit for purpose. It was nothing in terms of what it would be like in the real farmed environment, and it showed, even in those artificial conditions, that it was very difficult to spread the disease. But that doesn't stop the government, the veterinary industry, and the farming lobby from continuing to blame the badger as the key source of transmission and to claim that by killing it, they'll reduce the spread of the disease significantly. That is a political exercise. It's an economic debate. What it isn't is a science-based animal welfare debate. And that's why we as the Badger Trust and Born Free and other organisations campaign and work so hard against this policy. As I said earlier on, urban development as well is something that we need to be very aware of when it comes to badgers. Because lots of different planning applications are going on all the time and badger sets are being affected. Crimes against badgers, as I said earlier on, are significant as well, from snaring, gassing, illegal filling in of sets. We have all the problems related to wildlife persecution across this country that relate to birds of prey, that relate to badgers, that relate to other species, but the badger is particularly at the front line of that battle for the protection of a wild species in our countryside. Badger protection groups are crucial in all these areas. What we find with our groups is we have volunteers, over 50 badger groups across the country, one here in Birmingham that's recently been set up as well. These individuals are trained to go out and find where badger sets are, to log them, to make sure that they can understand the areas where they're in and the threats that they face from illegal persecution and developers. They will work with the police to report wildlife crime. They will campaign in their local areas against badger culling. They will also do an awful lot of rescue and rehabilitation work because of road deaths of badgers as well. As I said earlier on, 50,000 badgers on average killed by the road every year, but many of these animals are actually injured. They're very tough, so you can hit them with a car, you'll knock them out, and then they'll wake up a bit later on. You don't want that to happen when it's in the back of your car. So what you do need is people that actually have a lot of experience, and volunteer groups do. They have cages, the right equipment to take the animals from the roadside, get them to vets, get them into rescue centres, and we actually have a lot of success in getting badgers back into the wild after RTA incidents as well. Badgers in gardens is a problem because these are the wonderful diggers. You know, I've been on quite a lot of programs on television where we've been dealing with badger-related problems in people's gardens. We've been on various shows where you've had gardens being sort of damaged by badgers, where we've had to lay mesh across the garden, where we've had to put in measures of gates and fences to prevent the animals accessing. The difficulty we have with badgers is they do live within our communities. If we force them out of one set because we build in one area, they will go somewhere else. And not like a bat or a newt, these animals will not basically go away quietly. They'll dig someone else's garden up, they'll dig under your fence or under your patio. So we as badger groups often help people in their local communities try and do the right thing to prevent badgers damaging their gardens, undermining their patios, but also protecting the species within the framework of the law as well. Getting involved really, which is where I want to finish with. At the end of the day, ethical volunteering doesn't just take place abroad, it takes place here in this country. The badger protection movement is one of the strongest and longest protection movements in terms of wildlife in Britain today. It's at the forefront of that battle for the future of the wildlife protection in Britain that has such a significant impact on the future of our wildlife habitats and our landscapes. We're always looking for more volunteers. I have leaflets with me today if you want to become a supporter of the Badger Trust. Support Born Free as well, because we're doing some wonderful work protecting wildlife at home as well as abroad, and very much on the front line of that battle for badger protection as well. Get involved. Because if you just join your local badger protection group, not only will you meet a lot of other people who care passionately about these animals, you'll get a chance to watch them in the wild, which is wonderful. You could get a chance to help rescue injured badgers. You could get a chance to help protect them from wildlife criminals. That is something worth doing. It doesn't cost you a huge amount of money. It doesn't mean you have to take months out of your job and travel around the world. You can do this in your local communities, day in, day out, and make a huge difference. That's what it's about. Get involved, and let's make a difference. Thank you very much.